Welcome to Beyond Your Wildest Imagination. This is a podcast about living a life beyond addiction, where people from the Cowichan Valley share their stories about getting sober, staying sober, and how good life can get. My name is Brandon Kirk, and I'm your host. And today we have a very special guest and a dear friend of mine. His name is Hwiemtun Roland, and in his 30 years of sobriety, he has done some extraordinary things. I'm really looking forward to learning from him as he shares parts of his story with us today.
Wonderful.
Welcome.
This in our language is like good morning. And Aitsnet is my name, Hwiemtun. We sit in a territory located in one of our villages referred as Helpolis. So this is a reference to Cowichan Bay. So, yeah. Good morning, Brandon. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing very well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for inviting me, and look forward to this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to just dive in a little bit here.
Sure.
And this podcast is about, or season 1 is about living a life beyond your wildest imagination after addiction and what that looks like in the community and how you're thriving now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd like to touch back on another piece of that puzzle is the struggle that everybody goes through. Because I know a lot of people out there are suffering right now, and I want to shed some light on that and shed some hope on it. And I'd like to see if you're open to sharing a little bit about your story and the struggles that you went through in your active addiction.
Yeah, perfect. You have a drink?
Just water.
I always like to use humor as a part of conversations and presentations, because it sort of starts to really look at the big picture. I shared earlier, some of the presentations I go into because it throws people off. And it's wonderful because it starts to make people think about the process of, again, colonization. And I always joke with people, I always say, a long, long time ago, way before McDonald's, John A. McDonald, that is. And we have to start to look at the history that the contact and all the process that happened through colonization. We sit in one of the 7 villages of Quw'utsun tribes, and this one was impacted pretty heavy during the colonization period. So we start to look at that whole process, and that's the thing we start to find that relationship of fragmentation. And again, why was the fragmentation? Why was the impact so, I guess, overwhelming, for Indigenous people throughout, basically Canada? Because again, we look at the colonization, it's global, it's everywhere. But in this territory, we're one of the last in that colonization process. So we're just over 100 years, not long ago. So we start to think about that impact and what that fragmentation happened to our communities. And we start to look at that impact of how you segregate and sever more tribal societies. And it's sort of a 3-tier system. We refer to it as a 3-tier system. So like a lot of colonial idealisms, all in the period, top down. So one of the first things you had to look at was to fragment these, tribal societies. We had to start looking at how do the colonial people, sort of break that system up. So one of the things, there's so many, we could be here for hours and hours. They say when we used to sit with our elders, we'd sit a minimal 10 hours going through what we call Hwiem, going through our stories. So you start to look at that fragmentation, and you start to think about, what is in a family. You have your elders, You have your parents, and then you have children. So to fragment that, one of the biggest systems of colonialism is that removal of children. So become residential school. Because now, that whole madness in those systems, it caused so much confusion. So when we start to think about those times, you start to think about psychologically, what is that doing to you? So a lot of those systems wanted to break your spirit down. We call our sali, your spirit, the whole relationship to everything. So, for example, there's a lot of abuse in those schools, most of them. Some people say they enjoyed, the educational pieces of it, but again, a lot of struggles. So one of the things, for example, a lot of the times when we are growing up, we all have long hair. So in those schools, they would want to cut your hair. So you're civilized, so you're not a savage, and all the other words that they used for us. But in our culture, the only time we ever cut our hair is if grandma, grandpa, or mom and dad die. So psychologically, what is that doing to us as children? They're telling us, well, your parents aren't here anymore. Your grandparents aren't here anymore. We are your parents now. So those whole pieces of psychology has been very challenging for a lot of the First Nations that have went to the schools. Because again, if you didn't end up in a residential school, you ended up in what they call day school. So you got to stay home. But was that any better? The schools are just the same process. So we start to look at a lot of that history of, the fragmentation and then the introduction of all these, resources, to take care of the adults. Children are gone. Grandparents, they're going to die. What do we do with the adults? So they brought in a lot of what they call the germ warfare, smallpox, introduction of all of that. Then another big wave of it to become alcohol. Our bodies can't relate that well to alcohol. We think we can drink forever, but in reality, no, our body doesn't accept it. We found out, that it doesn't work that way. So that part of it is the early introduction to a lot of the struggles, because now we become, unrelatable to, the foreigners coming in. I always share in schools when I'm teaching, I always ask people, how many times has our name been changed to fit into society? Because they're always changing our name to identify us. You were uncivilized, you were the savages, you were the unknown. All these names back to Indigenous, Aboriginal, First People, First Nations. They keep changing their name to fit a society that we, never grew up in as children. So when we start to think about, all that long time ago, what are we adjusting into? What are we adapting to? And that's a thing that's been, one of the bigger challenges, because language. We grew up with our language. We only spoke majority of the time Hulkaminum with our elders. But, when we started attending schools, we had to learn a different dialect, which is English, which we use now. So when we think about that, we always say it took about a year to, sort of beat English into us, because we couldn't pronounce words, we couldn't relate to words, we didn't understand a lot of it. So we started to look at the evolution of, our timeline. Like even myself, I start to think about all the elders and the struggles they went through. And, and we're sort of went through that process of reconciliation and listening to the stories, listening to the many, many elders throughout Canada telling their story, because they tried to tell their story, but their story was discarded. A lot of their stories, even in a process of sort of the law system, they referred to it as, again, hearsay. So our elders struggled, for years trying to tell their story, but they're discarded because there's no evidence, to your story. So that finally started to show its ugly face, a few years back when they started doing sonar and finding all these graves of these children that, again, justified the stories of our elders. So there's a lot of that process of suffering for a lot of the people. Then, what direction do you go? So we grew up in that system of, alcoholism. My parents were alcoholics, my uncles and aunties. It was everywhere. So we grew up in a reserve with that influence in our front door all the time. So we become a part of it. Learning more English language. And by the time we're teenagers, we blended very well into the system of alcoholism.
I can't even imagine the struggles that you've had to endure. Thank you for sharing.
Yes.
A bit of your personal journey that you've shared with me and part of your story that I can relate to is when you first get clean and sober and how difficult that is in social settings and reintegrating with people and having to say no. And that's, it's a really hard challenge. And I'd be interested to know if you could share a little bit about your challenges when you tried to reintegrate back into society after making that brave choice to stop drinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the times, sort of the early years when I started stepping away from everything, I used to always remember that when we'd go out and party, there was, some good times, but a lot of bad times. And one of the reasons I sort of started looking at stepping away from drinking and doing drugs and all the other pieces of it was I used to get tired of waking up and looking at my car and think, did I run anybody over? How did I get home? So those whole foggy moments of, what just happened? And then do it again and again and again and just become numb to that whole process. But when I started to really look at that fragmentation of my own family, like my daughter was living with me, and I was at that point of that unknown, because I was so foggy in my mind from drugs and alcohol, because I had I let her go. She moved out because I just couldn't relate to life anymore. My brain was just scrambled. So I started getting to a point where I didn't want to be in that state anymore, and decided to step out of that world, because I've always shared that with people, saying, you ever had friends and you say that I don't want to drink and drug anymore? Then your friends would just laugh at you. You'll never change. And I believed that for a long time. What would I do? Because this is all the friends I have. So when we go to a lot of presentations looking at that challenge, I always question people, from the time of partying, from the time of drugs and alcohol, how many friends did you have? I used to have hundreds of friends. But when you step away from it, how many friends do you have? Not very many. Because now you have sort of stepped out of that society. You've been ousted out of the society and nobody wants to relate to you. A few people will come and visit you. But yeah, the boredom of common conversation, not relating to drugs and alcohol, dwindles. And yeah, we got to go. See you later. Bye. So the commonality of finding that relationship, become, such a challenge. The isolation of, what do I do now? Then the challenge of getting a trigger of going back to that place. Maybe the only thing I could do is go back down to the bar or down to the nightclub, and then I can hang out with everybody because there is no one to spend time with. You'll find a few people, but not. They say we used to have house parties, be a couple hundred people show up every weekend. So when you step out of that world, it becomes, a whole new lifestyle. So, the same thing. I used to wake up and I used to always have, some hard drink or something to get me going in the morning. What do I drink now? Well, I enjoy coffee. But that's the thing. It's that whole mindset of how do you even function without that common blur of alcoholism? Because that's all it was. You'd get in this daze and then go out and do your day. And you really didn't want to relate to anything. Just, do the things you need to do and go home. Then you find friends you can party with and go into oblivion and pass out, wake up and do it again. So when you start to step out of that world, it's a whole new lifestyle, a whole new, I guess, internal relationship within self of that challenge of how do I keep doing what I'm doing? So treatment became a piece of it. Went to a treatment center and struggled in that place. But the biggest difficulty I started to look at was all the things I learned in the treatment center about culture and healing and taking care of yourself wasn't relative to the culture and the way we looked at things in our territory. And that's when, a lot of people would start to say, well, why are you doing these ceremonies? It's not our way. So now you end up in this limbo of, well, I thought I did a lot of work to heal, but now nobody's supporting and helping, to support what we're doing. And it was interesting because, there were a few other people, gentlemen that I knew and went through the same process, and we're all like, well, that was a waste of time. Now we're learning all these other cultures and we don't get any support where we live. So what now? So that process of, again, it's just human nature. You have to find that process or that placement of comfort. Because like our friends, we're just like, well, do we just start drinking again? Because nobody's supporting us here. Or do we start trying to find more cultural pieces that are relative to what we just learned? So that was a part of it, through even that, I guess, segregation from our own tribal society, because we were doing things different. So we started to find more people that were doing the cultural ceremonies we learned, like the sweat lodges, and to continue learning that aspect of our healing, I guess they call modality. But that was again more difficult because there weren't that many people in our territory. So we had to start looking around to find other people that, were using that form of healing.
Yeah. I can relate, and I'm sure the viewers at home can relate as well to that feeling of, first getting clean, some of the viewers, and not finding a place and not knowing where to go or what to do. And also that repetitive motion of doing something and telling yourself you'll never do it again. And then you're right back there the next day. But for you, I know in our talks you've mentioned travel was a big piece of your life. And I'd like you to share a little bit about that and how that helped you in your recovery and your journey. I know you used travel you even completed some of your school through that. And what was that like for you, finding home away from home?
Well, it's interesting. I love my parents. They used to always tell me to stay home, settle down, and get married. And when I started doing a lot of education, especially anthropology and archaeology, it intrigued me, because I always tell people that I was always intrigued by global societies, indigenous societies around the world. So when I was a young boy, this color really attracted me, this yellow color. So when we'd go into the store, I would see this book on the shelf, and I'd always be attracted to it. And it was always this bright yellow color. So when I started looking at this book, I started flipping through the pages, because with a lot of the things I look at is, they always say a picture tells 1,000 words. I couldn't read the book, but I enjoyed the pictures. So when I was a young child, I started looking through these pictures and thinking, this is so unreal. This can't be real. They can't be societies. They can't be people in another part of the world that look like this. So as I grew up into my early teens, my late father used to always get me National Geographic. So if you think about National Geographic and that yellow color on every book that came out, or every magazine that came out, I used to sit for hours looking at the photos of going, where's this tribe? Who are these people? And that started the interest of looking at tribal societies, because if I think of our tribal society here, a lot of our lifestyle was hunting, gathering. What happened to it? Where did it go? We do a little bit of it, but not full survival. So I started to really get intrigued into looking at more of the photos, more of the pictures, more of the landscapes. And again, tribal societies. Who are they? Where are they? What language do they speak? So I started to really want to learn more about that place, somewhere in the world. And it was interesting because I think again of my late mother and late father. I remember my late mother, used to always tell me to stay home. And I used to tease her because she said, you call your schmechten, your mind is getting too much in it. And I was telling her, I said, genetically, I cannot stay home. I figured this out. I said, genetically, I cannot stay home. And my mom used to, she'd go, shut, you're crazy. You're just crazy. But I would try to explain it to her in this way. I would tell her, great-great-great-grandpa, your side of the family, used to leave Kelpolis and journey all the way down through Seattle, all the way up the coast, as far as California. Then they'd go from California back up the Columbia River to visit the tribes called White Swan, the tribe up in that region, and then come back. Maybe 6 months journey. Then I think of my late father. I said, your lineage came from the Big Island of Hawaii, and they would travel back and forth to a place called Kamalahu at the time, which is now Malibu Beach. And they used to visit with the Chumash people, a tribal society there. And then they traveled up and down the coast, but they didn't come too far into what they didn't know. Again, there wasn't a label of British Columbia or Canada. It was way before that time. Then if looking at the stories of migration, Hudson's Bay Company ended up in the Big Island of Hawaii and understood from stories that the Hawaiians were solar navigators. So King Kamehameha II had some sons that were navigators, so Hudson's Bay hired them to navigate them across into the New World. So that's the thing I used to tell my parents. Genetically, I'm a traveler. So how can I stay home? Because the gene of my mom and the gene of my father, it's navigation and traveling. Yes, and my mom used to always just shake her head and, say I was sheeshless, crazy. I don't listen. So I started to look at a lot of the places and always keeping pictures in my mind of those books and thinking, geez, I'd like to go see that place sometime. I'd like to visit that place. And I did travel a little bit, when I was still drinking and drugging, but that's why I always tell people, when you drink and drug and you go on holidays, what do you see? You might as well just stay home and get drunk because you don't see anything, when you're in that state in another country. You just experience alcohol and all the other goofy things that go with it. So sometimes, like I always tell people, when I travel down to Mexico or Hawaii or those places, just partying, I don't really remember the trip. I remember some of the places we partied, but it's still a blur. So when we start to think about those places, I started to go back to school because once I stopped, drinking and drugging, I didn't hang out in the pubs. I didn't go out with people. I could go still sit in social gatherings, but so I decided to get out of the blue collar work and go back to school. And I always tell students, because I had a hard time in school, because I'd always fall asleep, because I'm in a square box. And the only time I sit in square boxes, a lot of times I just zone out and fall asleep. So I'd always ask students, how many of you fall asleep in class? And a lot of students say, yeah, I do. Yeah, because we learn differently. We're experiential learners. We need to go out doing things. So I started to realize that that's what I sort of want to look at doing as a part of my journey, a part of my experience. So I started looking at some of the cultural teachings. Can we do a program for our youth to take them on the land and maybe go hunting and gathering? Maybe go out and stay on the land. So that part of it was the beginning of a lot of the things I do now of that experiential learning piece. And because getting through, my degree of anthropology, I sort of looked at that struggle I had, and I had a wonderful professor who realized that I don't learn well in class. So she suggested at that time distance learning. So I had no idea what distance learning was. And she'd explained it to me about, how that semester, you take one semester in the university, then you step out into a distance learning program. So you would usually go 2 to 3 months into another country and just immerse yourself into different cultures, different landscapes. So one of the first ones I appreciated and really enjoyed was Peru, and to see that place. And then I remember it flashed back in my mind, looking at National Geographic. I'm going, I remember this picture. This is Sacsayhuaman. I remember this. Hey. So I started to really think about a lot of the photos I seen. So that was the beginning of stepping into such a different world. Again, we didn't understand the language. It was all Spanish. But we felt at home. Like I always tease my friends, I always remember getting off the plane in Cusco, and I was walking off the plane with my friend. She was First Nations, and I looked at her and I said, I think we're home. Everybody's brown. This is amazing. I think this is our house. This is where we should be. So it was a lot of fun, but again, it was such a extensive part of learning. So I had to look at what's a language, what's a culture, because there's nothing comparative to our culture back home. And the only piece that really fit with our culture was being on the land, and understanding. They used to call them apus, the mountain ranges out there, because we have our mountain ranges here, quite a bit smaller, but their idea of how they relate in their culture to mountains, we found so many similarities of the land reference from, more the Quechua people. So so it was the beginning of traveling.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It sounds like you had a pretty wild experience in your recovery and during your undergraduate program. Now, this kind of segues into the work that you're doing now, and having that cultural background through all that travel and your own cultural background. And now that has stemmed into the work you're doing now, this incredible work that you do. I've been lucky enough to be a part of it in some regards, and I've found it amazing. And I know quite a few people in this community that find it just mind-opening. I'd really like to hear more about that.
I always share with people, because there's so much to it. There's the depth of it is overwhelming. Sometimes, some trips have taken me a decade. Like India took me probably about a decade in my schmuck and in my brain to go through it, because it was just so overwhelming. It was immense. It changed everything. Yeah, that's the thing that we look at because of our scheduled time. And I remember the gentleman that brought me there, because that was part of our studies, was looking at a comparative of displacement of Indigenous people. But what's the continued cultural piece? So the gentleman that had invited me to travel with them, he said, well, why don't you look at the Tibetan monks being displaced from Tibet and the Indigenous people from here being displaced from their traditional land? Do they still speak the language? Do they still do the ceremonies? How much of it is retained? So that was my application to the university to say I'd like to do this study. They thought it was a great opportunity, plus to have somebody that spoke the dialects in India that would help me move through that process. So that process was 3 weeks studying at the Sarah J Monastery in southern India. So the 3 weeks basically turned into 9.5 months of just traveling. I didn't want to come home. It's just so much. Because again, in my fat head, National Geographic was kicking the shit out of me. Oh my God, this is Delhi. Oh, this is in my mind. And I wanted to see everything. So I tried to experience as much as I could, and with the sort of minimal knowledge I had, so I'd think about all the stuff I was looking at in school and trying to put it in my brain. Okay, where's this place? Then I'd meet somebody. Hey, we're going to this place. Oh yeah, I remember reading about them. You want to come? And that was a beautiful part of traveling, because people were just wanting to explore. So he was looking at that exploration of a lot of these places. Of course, you still run into, the party people, but more India is not a lot of party. It's a lot of deep, deep cultural pieces. So you think about all the culture there, it's overwhelming. So I had to sort of keep some sort of focus to say, I would like to learn about this. I want to go this. I want to go here. I want to see that. So I had to keep that in mind when I was traveling. But every time I went somewhere different, it just was so overwhelming. And that's the thing that the friend of mine explained when I went with him. He said, there's two things about India. I said, okay. He said, either you love it or hate it. Well, I guess I kind of loved the experience because it just kept me going. And I same thing, I would phone home and, because my family had no idea where I was. It was like he just disappeared. And that's the thing. I become like a chameleon, because I was dark, I had long hair. So I looked like I belonged there. And I could just travel, all over the landscape and experience trains. Those buses, sitting on top of a bus. I always wanted to ride on top of a bus. I seen pictures of it. I did it once, never do it again. This is crazy. What am I doing? And the train rides were just overwhelming. And I'd hear stories of them. But the people I met and traveled with were great. They traveled that land before, so they knew the systems of travel. So buses, trains. It was overwhelming. And then I got to a point where I went out from India to Nepal and then met some friends out there. And then decided to go out to Lhasa, Tibet. Take a bus ride through no man's land. So it was beautiful. Like I say, when we think about those stories, we think about those experiences and the places and times. Everything's evolving and changing, and that's the thing I always share with people. If we think of Tamal in Nepal, where all the hikers go, I talked to my friend about it, and they were there a few years back, and they said, yeah, you wouldn't recognize it. So it's like everywhere in the world, everything's evolving and growing, and people. So where do we go? So they call the urban sprawl, just keeps moving out. So a lot of the experiences over there, they say there's so many things we could talk about India probably for, probably 8 hours. Just from the time I landed in Delhi to the time I got on a plane out of Tibet to fly home. So I think about all those great experiences, and that's only a fragment of so many places I've seen around the world and different cultures I've seen around the world. And same thing, some days I sit there and just go, what just happened? Did 2 decades just pass? Wow. Who am I? What did I just do? So I think about, just over 3 decades of being drug-free, alcohol-free. And that's the thing I think about every time I travel, especially in Europe. People say, oh, well, you could get to try all the different beers. And no. And it was difficult because culturally, I've been to Peru a few times now to meet with the Quechua people. So they drink what they call chicha, which is alcohol. And it's really hard because it's culturally acceptable, and they're always giving it to you. So you're like, dump it on the ground, for Pachamama. Here's the poos. But they don't understand, why won't you drink? They don't see it as, a struggle. It's a part of their culture. So, so we always want to make sure that we look at that part of it. When I'm going into other cultures, is alcohol part of the culture? And I seen it in Korea. It's the same thing. They're always giving you something to drink, and you're like, no, no, thank you. I know what that'll do to me. That one definitely will knock me off my feet. Yeah, so a lot of that work has been beautiful to take so much of it home. And when I'm teaching in a lot of schools, I always want to use that reference of, yeah, what do we really know? Really, we know nothing. In the big picture of the global society, what is it we really understand? Because when you go into some society, especially in the Amazon, and you try to explain to them, I'm from Canada, and they just stare at you. No idea where Canada is. Just, what? Well, you're in the jungle. Yeah. And there's not that communication to a different world. It's opened in the last 3 decades, but 3 decades ago, a lot of those remote places had no idea of other places around the world because they just were hunter-gatherers living on the land. You ask them anything about the land, wow. You ask them anything about places around the world, they're just like, what? So we start to look at a lot of that piece of when I'm traveling of how to adapt and adjust and try to learn the language.
And so after all that traveling, I know that you run a Sacred Cedars Center. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the amazing things that you're doing in your life. I know that's one of them. And if you can speak to as much or as little as you'd like about that, but I'm sure the people at home would really like to hear about what you're doing now and how that Sacred Cedars Center came about, and what your hope is for the impact that it can have in this community.
So we refer to it as Chacha Shpeit Leitlem. Chacha is sacred, Shpeit is a cedar. Leitlem, we don't have a name for center, so we call it the home. Sacred Cedar Center home. Leilem's the only reference we could use for it. But probably 2 decades ago, I started to look at the work I was doing, especially with youth. I was doing a lot of youth programs. I did a program. I really enjoyed the program with an organization called Rediscovery, which really brought me into my comfort of being on the land and being able to share some of the we call Shnawaish, the teachings of our people on the land. What is it? Why is it? How is it? So I started to look at a lot of the old teachings of our elders because we spent, our parents would always leave us at Grandpa's house, and we'd have all the elder people, come to that place and share stories with us. We all, again, depended what child it was, they'd learn about plants, they'd learn about stories, they'd learn about family lineage. They'd all have different pieces that they would be responsible to learn. So a lot of the stories that I'd experienced was with one of our elders. There were so many of them. They're just amazing that these elders held on through all the conflict that they had. But his name was Tawashit. And I'm trying to find the article. I remember having that article. It was in the local paper indicating he was one of the eldest people in our territory. So Great-Grandpa Tawashit, last time I sat with him, he was 116. So I always ask students, do you think your parents are old? No, they're just young yet. Because our elders used to always say that when you reach the age of 100, then you're an elder. So I think about all those stories, and I think about, again, I discarded so much of it. So much of it didn't make sense because I'm trying to fit into a contemporary world. But when I started to think about his stories, about how he told stories and what the story meant, it really started to make sense to me that, oh, Tawithit was like a master. He was a doctor. He was a scientist. And he was all the contemporary labels that we could give him. Because then I started to think about all the things he was telling us. And I remember, when he was telling us as children about energy, about molecules, how things meld and blend into each other, how the root systems relate to each other, how psyllium makes that connection to everything. Didn't make sense to me as a child. Just like, okay, can we go play? When are you going to stop talking? So a lot of that now, once my brain stopped getting foggy from drugs and alcohol, trying to find places where I could relate and activate what we call cell memory. So a lot of the ways that we look at it now, we have to find a contemporary word. And when I'm sharing that with a lot of the work that we do, that word is déjà vu. And where is it? What is it? Because great grandpa would talk about that. He would always say that you're really not you. You're thousands of years old. As a child, just like, okay, whatever. Can I go play? But he would be telling us in our language. So that's the thing he'd say is, Outen is Hwiemtun, your story. As a child, this is your story. But, your story's old. So if you start to look at it genetically and start to look at that relationship to the scientific piece of it, of your cell memory, your cell being, well, you are your mom and dad. You are your grandma, grandpa. You are your great-grandma, great-grandpa. And that's the way he would explain it to us. That those cell memories sit in your celli, in your whole being. Then sometimes you'll have to relate to them or experience them. And that's when he used to say, the other relation is the trees and your water, because that was all here before you. So when I go to gatherings, I always hear people say, oh, all my relations. I always ask people, what does that mean? And a lot of people say, oh, it's about us as our group. So we see it differently. Because Tawithit would always say, were you here before the trees? Were you here before the water? Were you here before the mountains? Everything was here before you, and you are only a part of it. So I try to explain to a lot of students scientifically, we have 2 lungs. The earth has 2 lungs. We have maybe 75, 80% water in our body. So does the earth. So what's different? We're just a part of everything. So when we start to think about a lot of the teachings, I started to bridge them into more of a contemporary, science, math model. It's even like when you take kids spearfishing, physics. How heavy is a spear? How long is a spear? How fast is the water moving? Because you have to know that if you're spearfishing. So when we start to look at bringing students in, here's the things we would like to share with you. Here's the other things I learned from other cultures. Here's different languages. Here's different processes. So the basics. How do you start fire? How do you filter water? So we started bringing more students, onto the property we have in Duncan here, called the Sacred Cedars Center, and I'm always grateful for, we refer to them as our elder, my shayesh, she said, what's the name of your gathering place? You should have a name for it. Okay. Then she said, here's the name, Sacred Cedars Center. Okay. That's what it's going to be. So that's continued into today, that we have stepped into, such a diverse modality of healing for people, because I look at those old stories, those old teachings they call Shnawayash, the old teachings of how our elders spoke to us. And we look at even the work we do for sound journey work. Yeah, it's just a vibration. It's just energy. So a crystal bowl makes this sound, that activates the energy in your body. A drum makes this sound, activates a different part of your body. A flute will activate a different part of your body, because again, the way Cowichan would always say it is, your body, your your body, spirit feels, tells your ears to listen, then registered in your brain and becomes a part of a cell memory. And that's why a lot of the things we look at of going to the sweat lodge, going to sound journey, doing all the different cultural work we do, it's all relative to energy, because that's how the old people taught us. Yeah.
Wow.
So much in a short time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think for what you're doing is incredible. As we start to wrap up here, I'm wondering if there's anything a message that you would give to anybody out there that's still struggling in active addiction, or they're on their journey to freedom, really. And if you can pull anything from your story that would offer them hope, what would that be? What would that message be?
Well, we always think about these struggles or devastation of society. Society is going to be society. It's still going to be what it is. But like I explained earlier, it's finding that place, because there are those places that give the support. We had to find a way to reconstruct that support for what we're doing, because a lot of it is in that part of energy work. I always tell people that you don't have to travel around the world. You just have to travel inside yourself. So when we think about finding that Sali, that spirit inside of yourself, that's when you start to find the other part of that support for yourself. And that's the thing we try to share with a lot of different people struggling, going through the processes. Because a lot of people don't want to do sweat lodge. A lot of people don't want to do sound healing. But there's so many other modalities that you can take care of yourself. And it's the same thing. I know that with the addiction, because of some of the heavy drug use we're using, I know even my medical doctor said, you're going to have a lot of problems when you get older. Yeah, that was 20 years ago. Not really many problems. And the biggest part of it was, even the medical doctor said, well, how are your lungs and your kidney and your liver still functioning? Because you abused them. So I was lucky enough to be with an elder that used to use all traditional teas, traditional plant medicine, to, again, use to help clear a lot of the gunk out of my body. So that's the thing that I always encourage people is to, find out what you really want to do. Then you're going to find that place or that person. So look at what is it you really want, and be careful what you're asking for. And when I start to think about the endless journeys, the people I met and the people I sat with, just it was beyond my wildest imagination. And I think about one time I was sitting in a room with, because my friend was asking if I knew anything about Buddhism. And I shared with him, what I understood after my trip to India. And he invited me to be like a liaison with the visitors. And I always tell people it's just beyond my comprehension of sitting in a room with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, and Nelson Mandela. What am I doing here? I could be sitting in a room with a whole bunch of drunk people and not even comprehend anything, but I have to physically keep my mind. That's really the Dolly. That's Nelson. What? So that's the thing I encourage people is, if I can get through this journey, from all the, endless things that had happened, you just got to find that place for yourself and find, that support for yourself. Because, now I just get to experience all these beautiful journeys with so many people. So, yeah.
Oh, that's a beautiful message, Hwiemtun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If there's anything left that's on your mind that you'd like to share, if there's perhaps a song you want to share or anything else, now would be the time.
Well, like I say, we could probably be here for the next 10 hours just breaking down the experience, the structure, because when we think about, when we say in your shmashlin, they're just, it's so much. Because when I do presentations now, it's the same thing. Give me a timeline, give me some notes, because if you leave it wide open, you're going to be here a long time. And same thing, I had to do a presentation for a bunch of scientists, and we're in a room. And I was telling them about, because they had all these bright lights on. I said, turn the lights down. It's just really bright in here. It's just that buzzing is too much. But they all had their phones. They all had computers. And I said, just put everything away. You want to learn about the relationship, into the landscape, into the mountains. They call shmant, shmant, about the forest and that relationship of coexistence, on that mountain. But your shmash in your brain is so filled with many things that you think you know everything, but really, I will share this with students. It's amazing when you think about a computer, and if you put some information in the computer, that information returns almost instantaneously. Wow, that's amazing. But I always ask students, who tells Grandma Google and Grandpa Yahoo what to put on there? Do they know what they're talking about? And it really makes students think, and they're asking, wow, never thought about that. I just type it in and that's what it is. So it always goes back to really, what do we really know and what do we really understand? So when you think about the way that we learned from our elders, it again, Grandpa Tawithit was such an inspiration. I think about him all the time and the way he spoke about things, about that relationship to that land and how we look at things. It's like when we share information about ethnobotany, there's so much to it. But again, what's a relationship? If we go to collect plants, how do we make a relationship? And that's the thing I was trying to explain to the science group was, what is a relationship you make in ethnobotany with the plants? And they're like, what? Here's an example. Say my grandma, my shayesh, wasn't feeling well and asked me if I could get some, what they call schlachen, some medicine. I would go to the forest. First of all, I'd say, where's your illness? What illness do you have? I would take that information to the forest and explain to the forest, here's what Grandma's struggling with. In here, amongst all of you, one of you are the medicine for Grandma. Then I would leave an offering. First thing daybreak came, the day is breaking. You always go in the morning. Then you go back next morning, same thing. Ask the forest, what is it Grandma needs? Go back the third day, make that offering again. But it isn't until the fourth day that you go out that you're looking for that plant. Because again, is it this long spindly plant? Is it that tall plant there? What plant is it? How do I talk to the plant? So you have to find a vibration and find out what is the vibration and what vibration do I send, because Grandma told me where her illness is. What is that vibration? So you find a vibration to send to the forest, and then that plant will let you know which one it is. So when we go to the forest, we want to make sure that we are speaking. And you think about these plants all coexisting. Yeah, 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 hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, yo, ah, yeah. And you project that voice into everything. And these plants will all start talking to each other. Then one plant will say, this is what your grandma needs. Because if we make that relationship with that plant, that plant, they can relate to you. And again, you bring that plant to Grandma to help her. Because in our contemporary time, we would go out in the forest the first day, grab that plant and pull it out. Then you find out your grandma's not getting any better, she's getting worse. And I always ask, students, why do you think Grandma's getting worse when you gave her medicine? And people say, well, because what you're giving Grandma in a contemporary model, if you go out the first day, rip that plant out of the ground, you're giving Grandma now a dose of trauma. Because you have no relationship to this plant. And you've taken it out. It's like a human being. You cause trauma to a human being, yeah, they're going to get very, very sick. So if you make a relationship, find out what this plant is, find out what the sound is, what the vibration is, that plant will be giving. It'll be helpful. So that's one of the things we share with people trying to understand that relationship. I'd say in our culture, we always hold our hands up because Grandma used to always say that, Chaelish, these are your receivers. Now they're filling your sali, your spirit. And we always encourage people to, look at different things, understand different things, learn different languages, because our brain is operating, on a borrowed language. And what is our old language? What is your Indigenous language? When we think about that, when we're speaking our language, it changes our cellular structure. When we sit and converse in languages. So you think about other people who don't really speak English. What's a struggle for them? Because in their language, if they spoke each other's language, they'd understand. But if they don't understand another language, how hard is it for them? And that's the thing I encourage people is, try understand other cultures and languages, because, we really know nothing. So keep learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here on the Beyond Your Wildest Imagination podcast. We look forward to coming back to the Sacred Cedars Center and enjoying more of your modalities.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And remember to find Sacred Cedars Center. We're trying to hold it in the old format. We don't have Twitter. We don't have Instagram. We don't have a website. You might find us on Facebook. But most of the time, people find us that are meant to find us. And that's the way we look at it, is if you're there for a reason.
Yeah.
And we reference that now to an old term they used to call 6th degree of separation. The old term was somebody knows somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows you. And I tell a lot of people now we're at 0.1% of separation because of technology. So come find me.
Beautiful. All right.
Hey,
We'll
thank
leave
you.
it at that. Thank you.
Have
Thank
a
you so
great
much.
day.
Yeah, you as well.
I always tell people, enjoy your life or I'll do it for you.
Yeah.
Have fun.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Brandon.
much. Really appreciate it.
Yes.